The Vatican has announced the death of Pope Francis. He died this morning at the age of 88. This is the scene at the Vatican now, where crowds are gathering in St. Peter's Square. It was here 24 hours ago that the Pope was last seen in public as he blessed thousands of Easter worshippers. King Charles, who met Pope Francis just 2 weeks ago, said he had profoundly touched the lives of so many.
Good afternoon. Pope Francis has died after a long period of ill health. The Vatican said the 88-year-old, who was the first South American to lead the Catholic Church, died this morning. Mourners have been gathering in St. Peter's Square, where Pope Francis yesterday appeared to wish Happy Easter to thousands of worshippers. From presidents to royalty, tributes have been paid from across the world. The King said he and the Queen were most deeply saddened. Sam Holder reports.
This was his final appearance. Pope Francis greeting packed crowds at St. Peter's Square yesterday, with just enough strength to utter a simple sentence.
Cari fratelli e sorelle.
Dear brothers and sisters, Happy Easter. It was then with relative shock this morning that high-ranking cardinals delivered this message.
Con profondo dolore.
With deep sorrow, I must announce the death of our Holy Father Francis. At 7:35 this morning, the Bishop of Rome, Francis, returned to the house of the Father. His entire life was dedicated to the service of the Lord and his Church.
The Pope's simple final message mirrored his very first in the role. It wasn't a blessing, just good evening.
Buonasera.
That more informal style became a hallmark of his papacy, focused on face-to-face interactions with the very poorest and most marginalized. Pope Francis was born Jorge Mario Bergoglio in Buenos Aires in 1936. He became the city's archbishop, renowned for always taking public transport and his closeness with the city's poorest. That rejection of a lavish lifestyle continued once he became pope, the first ever from South America, refusing traditional papal comforts and accommodation, instead being driven around in a Ford Focus.
He had this kind of openness to everybody, whether it's a cleaner or a cardinal, and that kind of enabled him to make all sorts of, space for people. The baby crying in church, he'd say, don't worry, feed the baby.
His first official trip was to Brazil, where he was greeted by more than 3 million. His comparatively liberal stance led to fierce divisions within the church. Asked for his position on gay priests, his response was, "Who am I to judge?" But he still rejected gay marriage. The 88-year-old spent 5 weeks in hospital after he was admitted with pneumonia in February. A few weeks after being discharged, he met with the King and Queen. Today, King Charles said, "We were greatly moved to have been able to visit him earlier in the month. We send our most heartfelt condolences and profound sympathy to the church he served with such resolve, and to the countless people around the world who, inspired by his life, will be mourning the devastating loss of this faithful follower of Jesus Christ." But many will remember Pope Francis for his solidarity with those suffering.
Pater.
Even yesterday, in his Easter message, he urged once more for peace in the Middle East and Ukraine.
People have been attending Catholic churches across the capital today to pay their respects to Pope Francis, who has died aged 88. Our reporter Matt Graveling has spent the morning at Westminster Cathedral.
A service centred around new life this morning changed to a requiem, a mass for the dead. Just hours before people gathered here, the Vatican had announced that Pope Francis had died.
I cried. He was just very special, and he understood the poor and the needy, and he was just excellent.
Can you just describe to me the emotions and the atmosphere inside Westminster Cathedral today?
I think it's one of respect and solemn dignity recognising his contribution to the world.
An additional 300 seats have been placed inside of Westminster Cathedral, increasing the capacity to around 1,500 for the Easter schedule. I've been speaking to some of those leading Mass, and they say now, with the announcement of the death of the Pope, the rest of the day's services will be altered.
The priest leading the Mass had studied for 4 years in Rome, and the Pope used to come on a special day, so he had seen him 4 times.
You're here for an Easter service, but just tell me, what was the emotion like inside today?
Well, I think it was rather somber, and I think it was shocking to a lot of people, because I don't think any of us had heard the news yet till we had gotten to the service.
Just some of the thoughts and emotions from people who have been either attending Mass or simply coming here to central London to light a candle. And for anyone who can't be here in person, the 5:30 p.m. Mass will be streamed online. Matt Graveling, BBC London.
Pope Francis, the head of the Catholic Church, has died at the age of 88. The Vatican says he died at 7:35 this morning. In a statement, it said the Pope's entire life was dedicated to the service of the Lord and his Church, and that he taught people to live the values of the gospel with fidelity, courage and universal love, especially towards the poorest and most marginalised. Well, this is the Vatican this afternoon. Mourners are gathering in St. Peter's Square to pay their respects to the Pope. He was already in his 70s when he was elected in 2013. He'd been suffering from ill health and was admitted to hospital in February for pneumonia in both lungs. He'd been discharged last month after 5 weeks of treatment for an infection. And he was last seen in public just yesterday, appearing on the balcony overlooking St. Peter's Square to wish Happy Easter to the thousands of worshippers who had gathered there to see him. Well, tributes from around the world are being paid to the Pope, who was the leader of more than 1 billion Catholics. We will be looking back at his life and hearing some of those tributes. And we'll be looking at what happens next as his successor is chosen. Our first report this afternoon is from our religious editor, Alim Makboul.
To the end, there for those who felt most connected with, greeting the masses on Easter Sunday, his last public act.
Cari fratelli e sorelle, buona Pasqua.
Always a pope devoted to his work, finding it difficult to rest even when told he had to. Recently meeting the king after his 5-week stay in hospital, and yesterday, the US Vice President. His surprise election in 2013 would mark a more radical break with the past than many expected. Jorge Bergoglio did have Italian roots, but was born in Argentina. While studying for priesthood, he worked briefly as a nightclub bouncer. While many fellow Jesuits were jailed and tortured during Argentina's military dictatorship, he rose to become Archbishop of Buenos Aires, some accusing him of forging too close a relationship with the regime. As Pope, he greeted his flock having taken the name of a saint who championed the cause of the poor. Francis signalled that his pontificate would be rooted not in Rome, but in the lives of believers around the world, and especially those on the economic margins. His style was informal, even when conducting ceremonies, and his first act as Pope was to pay his own hotel bill. In his early gestures, like washing the feet of the elderly and prisoners, he showed desire for his priests to be closer to the disadvantaged. He spoke out for the protection of migrants and refugees, laying a wreath on the waters where so many died on their perilous journeys. He travelled widely, drawing energy from the crowds. In Brazil, 3 million gathered on Copacabana Beach. And in the Philippines, he broke records for the world's largest mass, as 6 million turned out to join him. He linked economic inequality to the environment. In a video launching a papal encyclical, he said climate change amounted to rich countries inflicting damage on poor ones.
The Pope of the Holy See!
In 2015, he became the first pope to address the US Congress.
I am most grateful for your invitation,
telling the world's richest nation to take care of Mother Earth.
God bless America.
He apologized for the scandal of sexual abuse of children by priests. His words here spoken by a translator.
God weeps for the sexual abuse of children.
On a visit to Ireland, the first by a pope in almost 40 years, he apologized to victims at almost every event, but scandals continued to emerge. His papacy marked something of a change of tone on the subject of homosexuality, early on remarking, "Who am I to judge?" when talking about a gay bishop. But some progressives argue that in practical terms, the Vatican's stance and the Church's teachings have changed little. Even so, conservative Catholics viewed him with suspicion. But in some ways, he was as traditional as Pope John Paul II, whom he made a saint. And he had very conservative views on abortion, contraception, surrogacy, and gender reassignment. His style of papacy, though, couldn't have been more different to his immediate predecessor, Benedict XVI, whose funeral he presided over. Through the scores of cardinals from the developing world he appointed, he changed the complexion of the church hierarchy, consolidating a shift in the centre of gravity of Catholicism away from Europe, where it was in decline, toward Latin America, Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. In recent years, Pope Francis was beset by health issues, most noticeably affecting his mobility, but he found it hard to pare down his busy schedule.
Buona domenica a tutti.
He was, above all, a pastoral pope, a man of humility who preferred the fellowship of ordinary believers to the trappings of ecclesiastical status and power.
Alim Maqbool there. Well, let's go to the Vatican now. Rupert Wingfield-Hayes is there for us, and tell us about the reaction there this afternoon.
Well, Sophie, as news has started to spread across Rome this morning that the Pope had died, people have begun to come here to St. Peter's. People are streaming in now as we speak. There's obviously shock at the news and sadness. Some young people we've spoken to talked about how much he cared about young people, that he was a progressive person who cared about the poor and the young. There's tremendous sadness, obviously, from the Catholic faithful. Perhaps not a huge surprise. The Pope was very, very sick last month, and he was close to death a couple of times, we understand, in hospital. We thought he was recovering. I was actually here in the square yesterday when the Pope came out to do the Easter blessing on the balcony of St. Peter's behind me, and then drove around the square in his Pope-mobile. People were very excited to see him. We spoke to people yesterday who said, "We've been praying for him. This is a sign that he's getting better. We're so happy to see him." But he also looked extremely tired and very, very frail. You could see when he spoke yesterday, his voice was extremely thin. He was struggling to get the words out. And his doctors had advised him to take more rest. But Pope Francis, during the whole of his papacy, was absolutely committed to spending all of his time, or as much of his time as he could, with the faithful, with his flock, if you like. And I think it's very clear he wanted to be here yesterday, despite the fact it clearly took a heavy toll on him. And, you know, we've now got this news today that he passed away early this morning.
Rupert Wingfield-Hayes with the latest there from the Vatican. Thank you. Well, the Catholic community around the world is paying tribute to Pope Francis. The bells of Paris's Notre Dame Cathedral rang out 88 times for Pope Francis, and a service of remembrance has been held as people gathered to attend Easter Mass. When the cathedral reopened in December, Pope Francis said the rebirth of Notre Dame was a sign of renewal for the church in France. And these are the pictures inside Buenos Aires Metropolitan Cathedral, the city of Pope Francis's birth. Before becoming pontiff, he was the Archbishop of Buenos Aires for 15 years. His countrymen have praised him for the humility and simplicity with which he approached the role. King Charles and Queen Camilla were among the last to meet the Pope in person. Their state visit to the Vatican had been cancelled this month because of the Pope's ill health, but he was well enough to hold a private meeting with them. They are among many who have been paying their own tributes to the Pope since his death was announced this morning, as Joe Inwood now reports.
In St Peter's Square, in the shadow of the balcony where just 24 hours before he had made what would turn out to be his last appearance, the news of the death of Pope Francis quickly spread. Even for those who had seen him speak, looking so frail, the news was no less shocking.
I was sort of really shocked because I was here yesterday at Mass and I saw the Pope and he looked just so fragile, you know.
I was just on the phone to my mother and she said you guys were so lucky to receive that last blessing for him. But also it was so difficult to see him in that state because he was always such a smiling Pope, such a happy Pope.
I find it very significant that the Pope has died during Easter or the Easter weekend. I'm from Argentina, the Pope is Argentinian, so, you know, it has quite a bit of significance for us.
In Jerusalem's old city, they marked his passing. In the Philippines, home to millions of Catholics, special Mass was said for their spiritual leader. Prayers were said in Nigeria. In Jakarta, where there is a small but devout Catholic population. While in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, a land in the grip of violent uprising, people paused to pay their respects. Pope Francis was a leader who reached beyond the world's 1.2 billion Catholics. His death was quickly marked worldwide.
His was a papacy of firsts, the first pope to hail from the Americas, the first Jesuit pope, and the first to take the name of that great champion of the poor, St. Francis of Assisi. Pope Francis' compassion embraced all humanity, and today he will be mourned by Catholics and non-Catholics alike.
At France's recently reconstructed Notre Dame Cathedral, the bells rung for his passing as people gathered to pay their respects.
Throughout his pontificate, he's been at the side of the most vulnerable and fragile, with a great deal of humility and a very special sense of humanity in these times of war and brutality. And in this, he was faithful to a tradition that was dear to him.
While Sir Keir Starmer said Pope Francis was a pope for the poor, the downtrodden and the forgotten, he was close to the realities of human fragility, meeting Christians around the world facing war, famine, persecution and poverty. Yet he never lost hope of a better world. One of the last global leaders to see the Pope in person was King Charles, who said that he was deeply saddened by his death, adding that throughout his work and care for both people and planet, he profoundly touched the lives of so many. And at cathedrals all around the UK, people began to gather. In Westminster, preparations are underway for a special Mass.
Why will he be remembered for you?
As a strong man with determined to change the world.
Shocked really, because when we saw him yesterday I thought he was getting a bit better. So it was really sad this morning when you heard that he's actually died.
Yeah, I think the whole Catholic community is going to be devastated, first of all, even though that we knew it, that his health has been quite in a balance for some time. But as a leader of the Catholic Church, it is a devastating news for all of us, definitely.
Cardinal Vincent Nichols said a voice for proclaiming the innate dignity of every human being, especially those who are poor or marginalised, is now silent. The legacy he leaves is one we must seek to carry forward and strengthen. Easter Monday Mass is always significant for Catholics, today more so than ever. Special services are being planned across the UK to mark the life and death of Pope Francis. Joe Inwood, BBC News.
Well, Argentina has just announced 7 days of national mourning. Argentina, of course, where Pope Francis was born. Mark Easton is here with me, and it's going to be a huge shock despite people knowing he was suffering from ill health. Look back now for us at his legacy.
He was a man, I think, who sought to embed radical change, to make his church less Roman and more Catholic, if you like, less focused on Europe and more on a diverse global congregation. He personally appointed almost 80% of the cardinals who will choose his predecessor. He wanted to bake in his vision of Catholicism, and he wants that to continue long after his death. But as anyone who's watched the movie Conclave will probably imagine, the politics and machinations of what happens next are likely to be convoluted. What I think we can say is that Pope Francis demanded that the Catholic Church become more humble, more focused on the poor and the dispossessed. He once said he wanted it to be a poor church for the poor. And that modest, that meek vision of Catholicism is perhaps the most powerful element of his legacy. I think he may go down in history as the Pope who changed the philosophy of the Vatican, the Christian thinking of the Catholic Church.